There we go. Okay, so I have the honor to welcome you all to the second speaker of our International Studies Fall Lecture Series. I will let Jamie do the introductions, but first off, I want to run through and thank and welcome everyone. So I want to thank Jamie, who organized the speakers for this series, and acknowledge and thank Steve Bishop, who's the director of the International Studies Institute, which is hosting the lecture series. Loyola Chastain, who is our administrative assistant and does all of the background work and really is the person who keeps this thing running. And I want to make sure to acknowledge and thank our sponsors. So we have assistance and support from the Latin American and Iberian Institute here at UNM, from the Sustainable Studies Program, also at UNM, from the Grand Challenges Grant Program, from the Department of Political Science, Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. And I think that covers them all. But first and foremost, I want to welcome you all and thank you all for tuning in. And thank Rebecca very much for joining us here for the talk. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie to do the introductions.
Great, thank you, Ian. Welcome to all of my students in the politics of water in Latin America, and to others joining us. I'm pretty excited about this talk because we've been talking about this book that Dr. Abers is going to be presenting on today. So I'm so pleased to have Dr. Rebecca Abers join us. She's at the University of Brasilia. She studies politics of institutional change, the construction of participatory decision arenas, which those of you who are my students, we just talked about the development of participatory budgeting in class, and the role of actors inside the policy processes, basically the messy politics of creating and shaping and implementing laws and reforming bureaucracies. So she's a specialist in urban and environmental problems in Brazil. She's the author of Inventing Local Democracy, Grassroots Politics in Brazil, and also the co-author of this book with Margaret or Mimi Keck, A Practical Authority. Can you see that? I can see. Agency and Institutional Change in Brazilian Water Politics, our reading for the week. She's currently conducting research on COVID, it sounds like, and probably some very interesting insights on activism and social movements, environmental politics in Brazil, it sounds like as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jamie and Ian and everybody else. And such a pleasure to be here. So exciting that people read my book and that I can talk to you a little bit about it. The book I wrote with Mimi. And well, I'm just going to start off and then sharing my screen, because my hope is not to, I tend to talk too much. So my idea is to try to more or less control myself. Here, well, I couldn't decide what, I gave a title to Jamie, but I've changed it and then I've changed it again. And the first title I thought of here today was Ideas and Creative Action in the Construction of Water Management Institutions in Brazil, which is sort of the subtitle of my book. But what the mood I was in by the time I was done was the frustrating struggle to create a new institutional framework. And this is partly because, 7 years have passed since that book was published, and not much has happened since the story that I tell in that book, or that we tell in that book, happened. And so basically, what I was going to do is talk a little bit about this, why this process was so frustrating. I decided to not give a theoretical talk today. I mean, I love the theoretical part of our book and the whole discussion of action and creativity. But since your class is about water, I decided to do more of a water talk, and to talk more about sort of the attempt to create institutions for this specific thing, water, and why it has been so difficult to do in Brazil. Okay, so that's kind of, I figure you've read the introduction. You probably haven't read the whole entire book. Yeah. So, I mean, knowing people, only a few of them have, so I'm kind of summarize a lot of what the rest of the book is about, and talk a little bit about what's happened since then. But what has us, I've been saying that it's a little odd, is that not much has happened since then. And so that's kind of part of the story and part of the frustration that I want to talk to you about, and try to talk about how we talk about frustrating things, because a lot of things that we study end up being frustrating. Um, so let's go. So ideas and the frustrating struggle to create a new institutional framework. Well, the story that we tell in the book is about the construction of a new integrated water management system, right? Based on the idea of integration. And so in a sense, it had to do about creating something that did not exist, a new area, a new arena for policy, for authority, for power. And what existed before the 1990s was a system that was both simultaneously centralized and fragmented. You had centralization in that the energy sector was the most powerful water-related sector in Brazil. Brazil had huge investment in hydro energy related to the, since the 30s and the creation of the developmentalist project and the need to have energy to support the developmentalist project, and a lot of the abundance of water in Brazil implied that this was a resource for development. And so energy always had kind of the top hand in decisions about water management. Anything that was more national based, more kind of system-wide decisions were made by the energy sector. But there were other water related sectors that had their own water management programs. Like for example, irrigation was a completely separate system, and indeed water rights for irrigation were issued by one agency, while water rights for energy were issued by other agencies, and conflicts between these didn't happen that much before the 1990s because of the relative abundance of water and but as urbanization and development occurred more and more often, these different sectors that had been kind of managing water, sanitation was not national, it was belonged to the state governments. Brazil is a federation, kind of like the United States, with municipality states and the union, and there was different water responsibilities were connected to different areas. And of course, a continental country with extremely diverse problems, ranging from so much water in the Amazon region that it's almost impossible to create sanitation treatment centers in big cities like Manaus and Belém, because there's just no place to put them, because they're all, almost floating cities, to drought-ridden Northeast, to huge cities with huge water quality problems, both drought and floods in regions like São Paulo, kind of one after the other, agricultural areas that have competition for quantity of water. It's just kind of all the different kinds of problems that you could possibly imagine due to the size and the complexity of the country. And yet there was no system for managing all these different uses in a single system. So what we're talking about here is the movement to create something that didn't exist, this integrated water management system. And the process of doing this was pretty complicated. It was a big country, and to make it more complicated, the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, basically since the 30s this had already existed, but it was established and reaffirmed in 1988 that water was a public good. It could not be privatized, but that it, that water in its natural state in water bodies is a public good. But that it has dual dominion, that water bodies that are within state borders, that are that start and stop within I can't remember how to say these things in Portuguese, in English anymore, but that start and stop within a single state are under the dominion of state governments, and that cross state borders or international borders belong to the union. And so you need to have both 27 state water management systems and a national water management system. And this was taking a long time for the national water law that the 1988 Constitution said that would need to be created wasn't being implemented. And so the state of Sao Paulo, which was by far the most advanced and most development state in Brazil, passed its own water law in 1991 that proposed a kind of new integrated water management system, which I will basically start explaining in the next few slides. And this Sao Paulo model was emulated by other states. Some states followed Ceará, a completely different system. Ceará is in the Northeast, and its system was much more based on the problem of scarcity in agricultural areas. in drought-ridden areas. In 1994, the Ceará state model, a different model was proposed, and some states in the Northeast more or less copied Ceará. And then the federal 1997 law adapted the São Paulo system, but changed it in several significant ways, details I'm not going to go into, and other states copied the federal system. So basically you have 26 states in the federal district in Brazil, each with a slightly different water model, and then the federal system with this kind of overarching model for management, and river basin organizations and institutions that are being created at both levels and having to integrate to each other. So you have an overlapping, complicated system, which is going to be slowly implemented starting in the early 90s and continuing to this day. You know, a very slow process of implementation in which the tensions between state and federal river basins are never really resolved, just as the tensions between different sectors of economic sectors and between water-related issues and environmental issues and land use issues. All of these complex relationships are never really completely resolved, despite the fact that the water laws almost all say that they should be. And that's part of what I want to talk about, is why a lot of this didn't get resolved. To understand this all, to move my, one of the things that we talk about in the book, chapter 2 of the book, is dedicated to this idea of this competition between different policy narratives in Brazilian politics in general, but specifically in the case of the water management process. You have a developmentalist tradition, that tradition of supporting energy for economic development, strong state intervention, strong state regulation, investment, and you know, kind of a top-down technocratic approach to regulation based on technical ideas to support economic development. You have, since the 80s, the increasing influence of neoliberal market-based approaches, the push to make the system pay for itself, to promote more efficient water use. Charging for water would be a mechanism for promoting both of these things, efficiency and, you know, and paying for the system, reducing dependence on the state. Of course, you have an increasing fiscal crisis in the 1990s, which makes the state less capable of paying for stuff. And so these market-based ideas start to become seen as financial solutions for how to manage water. And at the same time, a sort of particularity of the Brazilian experience was the growing agenda of participatory democracy, which, starting in the 80s and expanding in the 90s, begins to typify many, many different policy areas, especially social policy. Participatory budget is part of that story, but there's also an expansion throughout the country of different kinds of bodies with civil society participation, or civil society and government participation, for deciding different policy areas. And this is sort of becoming, as part of the transition to democracy in Brazil. Brazil's transition occurred in the mid-80s, and part of the commitment to democratization became translated into Brazil as a commitment for creating more democratic arenas for decision-making. And this is probably one of the things that made the process in Brazil most interesting, is the strength of the participatory idea and how this would intervene in the process of rethinking how to manage water. So what happens out of all this? I'm not going to explain all the details and all the variations because it's too complicated, and you can read the book if you really want to know. But basically, there grows out of this a kind of unified water model that's more or less what you get in the 1997 national law, which is copied more often by more states and becomes the most influential, which basically has the following idea, you know, that you would have a multi-layered system with public agencies, participatory councils interacting. And so you have federal and state government agencies responsible for allocating water rights, and they would use technical criteria for these water rights. You would have councils with civil society and government and users, you know, ranging from industries to sanitation companies, you know, sort of the whole variety of different actors that use water, that would participate in these councils at the federal level. There's a federal National Council of Water Resources, and each state created their own council to define the general rules for their region of dominion. And then the big change would be the creation of new institutions at the river basin level. Basically two types of institutions. And this process is occurring both at state river basins and in federal river basins, which eventually began to be called interstate river basins, to try to emphasize the need for cooperation and connection between the sub-basins, because any river basin, a river basin that crosses state boundaries is going to be made up of rivers that don't cross state boundaries, or tributaries that don't cross state boundaries. So they began to be called interstate river basins. And two different kinds of institutions were created in each river basin, or could be created in each river basin. River basin committees that were participatory, that had seats for civil society, government, water users, different kinds of makeups depending on state and on the federal level. And then what were called water agencies, which were supposed to be the executive arms of the committees. The decision makers would be these participatory spaces, but they would get an executive agency that would implement their decisions. And that was key to the whole model. And then a new system for funding all of this, which was the idea of water charges. Committees would decide the prices for water charges to be allocated that users would have to pay, but they would also decide how to use the revenues. And key to this idea was that that for the whole system to work, you would need to have the revenues returned to the basin where they were implemented. So river basin committees in a river basin would decide that water, a certain type of user would have to pay a certain number of, a certain amount of money for each cubic meter of water that it used in some way. Perhaps, allocation, different kinds of uses would be charged in different ways. So they would do a whole process of deciding how to charge. Users would pay the charges, and the money would return back to those river basin committees or back to the agencies, and the river basin committees would decide how to spend them. So let's see, I have another slide that explains this a little bit better, that the idea of the water charges would be that it would have this dual purpose. At the same time that you would create a new source of funding for water infrastructure, and in the 90s was a time when the fiscal situation was bad. The federal government didn't have a lot of money for big infrastructure, for large scale projects. So there was a demand for new sources of funds for water infrastructure. And at the same time, it was expected to rationalize water use. If you have to pay for something, you're going to use it more efficiently. That was sort of the basic idea, because until then, if you could take water out of the river that went by your farm, or in some other way collect water, you're only paying for the cost of taking it out, but not for the water itself. So there would be a rationalization of water use involved. But to make this process more democratic, the users themselves that were going to pay would participate in the definition of the prices, and in the decisions about how the revenues would be used. They were on those committees, and so they would get involved in the whole process. A system that was inspired by the French water reform. I don't know how much you know about that, but the French water system basically created a system very, in many ways similar to this one, with committees and agencies, except the committees were made up only of water users, mostly sanitation agencies, that basically, they called it a condominial system, because basically in France, the sanitation companies or the users would get together and say, how much money are we willing to pay for the next 10 years for water infrastructure, and how do we want to use it? And then they would commit to paying that money, and then they would pay for infrastructure to improve the water conditions of their river basins. And so this experience that started in France, I think in the 70s, forget right now, but it had already been a sort of the big model, and many water engineers in Brazil who were defending this new system had learned about the French system. They proposed that something similar would be done. You'd have a system in which there would be commitment to it occurring and to it being implemented, because those people who were paying would also be taking part in deciding how the revenues would be spent. And the committees fit into the story like this. The committees would define the pricing schemes. Usually those pricing schemes would have to be approved at some higher level, but they would basically negotiate with these different actors how to charge, and then to determine how the revenues would be used. And the agencies were the executive arm. They would be controlled by the committees, and they would implement the charging process and the expenditures and all the research and information that would need to go into this process of charging and planning for investments and actually implementing different kinds of projects to protect water, improve water, or improve water quality or whatever. So, you know, it was kind of an elegant idea. And there was this triangular, at the essence of the water proposal was this kind of triangular relationship in which that would support itself. The committee would make the decisions, the charges would pay for the decisions, and the agency would execute the decisions. And the committee would, you know, control the agencies, and the charges would fund the agency. And, you know, it's kind of this lovely little idea, except that it wasn't really such a great idea in many ways. I mean, it was a great idea, but it was more complicated than that. It was more complicated in various ideas. This simple triangular wasn't really the only thing that was going on. For one thing, the committee wasn't exactly the way those condominial structures existed in France. Instead of just including the users, as occurred in France, the influence of the participatory agenda that I mentioned before, that a participatory narrative that was so important in Brazilian politics at that time, meant that you didn't make a committee just with the owners of industries and farms and sanitation companies or sanitation agencies participating. You also had government and civil society representatives who were representing the public interest in different ways and not just the private or the specific interests of those sectors. So the decision-making process wouldn't just include the users. And the charges were not exactly charges that were, it wasn't a privatization proposal. You couldn't buy more water if you wanted to in Brazil. The developmentalist legacy of state regulation continued and continues to this day. It's in the Constitution that water is public, and water rights continue to be defined through by state government or the national government agencies responsible for water rights, at least supposedly based on technical criteria. So you kind of like have a competition between the charges are about the water that you've already gotten technically approved to use. You can use it, but you're going to get charged no matter for how much you actually use. You're going to get charged for the amount you are approved to use. And to be approved to use something, you have to prove that you have the technical need for it and that there is enough water for, and the government has to make an assessment that there is enough water for you to use that, and that goes within the plans for the government for the use of water, et cetera. So you have kind of various little things that are happening here in this nice little diagram that has to do with other logics competing within the original idea, which if the French system perhaps was mostly an idea that would fit best with the more market-based logic, figuring it out for themselves kind of idea. And then, of course, it wasn't just that, Esau. I couldn't even figure out how to get everything else into this. I was going to make a slide that had even more little colorful squares, but I just gave up because there's other things going on. You have, within the water model, you have the idea that river basins should approve river basin plans, but these plans do not come with any obligations for anybody to implement them. So you have a huge planning requirement, but very little in which river basins can say, oh, we need such and such infrastructure. But if they can't get the money for that infrastructure, they're not going to be able to implement it. And then there's a few other things like water quality classification systems, information systems, not clear who was going to implement these things or how they were going to be enforced. And finally, there was a bunch of things that were left out because of the way water is defined. The attribution to governing water is defined in the Brazilian constitution. Most importantly, things that in many countries would always be connected to water use, having to do with river basins, land use, water quality, drainage. The whole land use field of decision making is within the Constitution attributed to municipalities, and water is a state or a federal attribution. So nobody could figure out how to require to force river basin force municipalities to obey the decisions of river basin committees that were not municipal level. They might have even some municipal members in them, but they were not obliged to obey the decisions of river basin committees. Environmental issues also in Brazil, the water sector is separate from the environmental sector. The water sector still remains a sector very strongly influenced by productive economic development issues, and the environmental aspect of water, the fact that water and the production of water requires forests, for example, and environmental protection, all that kind of stuff, is all the aspects of environmental protection that does not affect, that affects water, is a whole different water management, is a whole different policy sector that doesn't really connect with these committees or with any of the things that are going on in them. They're different agencies, different actors, they kind of disconnect. So we have disconnects and weird connections in the system that emerged. So what were they thinking? Well, there was this premise behind this elegant idea, which was very much founded in the idea that the participatory river basin committees would be a space for promoting collaboration, a kind of, by bringing together stakeholders in a single decision-making body within a river basin, you would bring everybody together that is involved in water management or is affected by water management, private, public, civil society representatives. And by bringing them together and having them talk, these different actors would eventually would learn to collaborate and cooperate, and the result would be effective water management. This is kind of the general form, that the language that the reformers used for why a participatory committee would be interesting and useful for this process, was what I understood as a very depoliticized conception of participation. The idea that participation would, if you bring people together, they will collaborate, they will work together, they will do stuff that they need, they will resolve their problems, rather than they will struggle, they will fight, they will oppress each other, they will try to, the more powerful will try to win, which those of us who study participatory arenas notice often happens. So it's a very voluntarist conception of participatory democracy, and it's a very idealized conception of market actors themselves, the belief that they themselves are interested and willing to resolve their own problems collaboratively, when in Brazilian history, those same actors, industries, the energy sector, all these other sectors have historically relied on the government to resolve their problems, on the state. The developmentalist paradigm has always been the main way that major collective infrastructure has been created in Brazil, and the market actors that somehow there was this expectation that once you're putting them, making that you would easily be able to make them take responsibility for their collective needs. So there was this very voluntaristic conception of participation, which also involved a rejection of having practically any clearly defined obligations or sanctions for those for things like a river basin plan that does not point to who is obligated to implement those plans, what are the sanctions for not implementing those plans. None of that is in the legislation. So what you see here is that although I said that these three different narratives are competing, a very neoliberal market-based vision and a kind of idealistic one is dominant here, a very idealization of the market and sort of voluntaristic concept of what is going on. And so many people that we interviewed over the years that we did that research reproduced this idea of what they would call the committee would be the parliament of the water. And the most important thing that you had to do in this parliament was to get rid of politics and just have technical debate. So there was a kind of anti-political conception, back in the 90s, back in the early 2000s, of what was going on, which I see as key to the problem of the way that the kind of idealization of what would happen that made it difficult to implement a more realistic system. Well, let's see. How long have I been talking? For about a half an hour, right? So let me try to get to the end. I said I was going to talk for a half an hour, but I still have a whole bunch of slides. So let me just try to zoom through really quick what happened with the result of this. Basically, as you may be sensing from the music behind what I'm saying, this was not going well. There was too much idealism, and the implementation was not going to be easy. Turned out that the water charging system proposed in these laws was almost impossible, could not be implemented right away. There were legal limits to creating charges in the way that the reformers had imagined it, basically because you couldn't create a whole new administrative unit at the river basin level and have it go around levying charges, what public charges. There had to be some, you know, that wasn't going to work. Only the union or the states could, or the municipalities could levy public charges. And if they did that, how would they keep the money? How would you guarantee that the money was going to return to the basin where it came from if the federal government was going to levy the charge? So so there was a period of, you know, almost a decade in which these charges did not exist or could not be implemented. And this meant that the committees didn't really have any specific power, because that was where the source of their money was going to be, in the charges. And they couldn't have the agencies, because the agencies could only be created if they had the charges, if they were funded by the charges. And so in this process, a lot of what the book is about two parallel processes of institution building, which I'm going to zip through here, and you guys can slowly read the book if you feel like it. But just to give you some examples of kind of what went on, two different processes. The first kind of, the first process was what happened in the river basins, in this kind of, while they were waiting for charging to occur, to become possible, while they were waiting for this new source of funding, river basin committees were being created. It turned out it was a lot easier to create river basin committees than any other part of the institutional model. Creating the agencies was hard, creating the charges was hard, but you could create these spaces for discussion and debate. And so they started to get created, both at the federal level and throughout the country and states. Hundreds of them were created in the state, and there are currently 10 federal river basin committees, which are very large. They cover a huge part of Brazil, because they cover many, like, very large rivers, most of them. And basically what the book talks about is about how, since the legislation wasn't really operational for what they're needed, many of these committees just didn't go anywhere. But the ones that did were the ones that reinvented themselves. They reinvented what their purpose was. And a lot of times what they did was connect to issues related to watershed protection, environmental action, or they did what we call mobilizing the state. They became spaces for getting the state to do the stuff that they couldn't do. And one of the examples that's, you know, it's kind of a nice example because it comes with a nice imagery, was in the Rio das Velhas committee, which it's in the kind of it's in the southeast of Brazil, in the state of Minas Gerais, 760 kilometers long river that crosses through one of Brazil's largest cities, Belo Horizonte, where the river gets extremely polluted, and then it goes through a huge rural area, and there's just quite a lot of variety of conditions and problems. But one of them is the pollution caused by the city of Belo Horizonte on the water. And one of the stories that we tell in the book, it's at the end of the book because it's one of the happiest stories, and I thought I'd give you a happy story, is about this committee in Rio das Velhas that in the river basin, the Velhas River Basin, there was also a civil society organization that was dedicated to water, and which is an unusual thing. There was not that many places in Brazil where there was a very strong civil society organization. And this organization had groups throughout the river basin operating and doing small-scale water-related initiatives of all kinds. And so when this civil society group they basically managed to take over the River Basin Committee in 2003, getting themselves elected to a large number of parts. And then they kind of combined this civil society mobilization that they were capable of doing with the committee, and created a mechanism for pressuring the government, which was very simple. It was an expedition, a highly publicized kayak expedition down the river's 700 and something kilometers, in which people would come out and there would be activities and events at each place. So I showed you one town that everybody in town came out to receive the kayaks. And so there was a lot of publicity around this. It was kind of a media stunt, basically. And after that, the committee was able to get the state government to commit to a heavy plan to invest in heavy infrastructure, largely major treatment plants, basically the first large-scale treatment plants in that city that would clean up, and it was kind of basically a major cleanup of the river effort. So they were able to use, kind of mobilization through the committee and then the whole thing worked in part by using that river basin plan that nobody ever paid attention to. But they wrote a plan that had a kind of official character to it, but the politics behind that of getting the government to commit to it was key, because they didn't have water charges to pay for the implementation of the plan. They had to get the state government to do that, and so they did it through mobilizing. So that's kind of one example of the kind of thing that happened in river basin committees who didn't have charges. They would do other things to try to get water-related issues advanced. And this is probably one of the most impressive stories, actually. There's a lot of not so impressive stories. At the same time, you had a kind of nationwide process of transforming the legislation to make charging possible. But this process occurred through a specific case, another river basin that was a federal river basin or interstate river basin, marked here, the Paraíba do Sul River Basin that goes through, it is important as a water source for the city of Rio de Janeiro, but it's also, the river basin is also in the states of Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo. And so it's a large river basin with a lot of industry. It was kind of conceived of as one of the ideal places for water charging because there was a lot of money in the river basin, a lot of industrial development. And so the federal water agency, the National Water Agency, decided together with the River Basin Committee of the Paraíba do Sul Basin, one of the first ones created, or was the first one created, to do a kind of pilot program to try to get water management going. And basically that's what happened. They managed through a process of negotiation with the local water users, especially the industrial users of the basin, to get them to agree to something that they had been up till then resisting to pay. And the users agreed to pay, but they made conditions. First of all was that these users who used the water of the federal river, Paraíba do Sul River, would only pay if the users using waters in the states that also belong to the basin, but that were not a federal river, would also have to pay the same charges. They wanted it to be equal for everybody, because so you had to have a negotiation between the states and the federal government. So there was a whole process of getting water charging going in those states as well, and not just at the federal level, a complicated process. They also had to have a guarantee that the money was going to return to the committee so they could decide how to use it. And they had to have what they called acceptable prices. And this mobilization to get this experiment in water charging going basically was a way, had the effect of getting the users who were economically powerful lobbyists to start to pressure the National Congress for a more non-experimental legislation. And basically, legislation was passed that basically created a workaround for the problems that were limiting the possibility for creating water charging and river basin agencies. That whole constitutional problem that I talked about before, and I'm not going to explain what the workaround was, but basically they were able to get legislation passed. It was in 2005, so 8 years after the first law was passed, this new law was passed, and you started to have a very slow process of creating this charging process in interstate basin. Well, then what happened? Well, as the charging started to happen, people started to realize that it wasn't the magic bullet that they had imagined. And part of the problem was that by getting the users involved, and part of the agreement was that the prices had to be very low. And if the prices are very low, you're not going to make a lot of money with these water charges. And so basically, it was very soon clear that in a river basin like that Rio de Janeiro river basin that I just mentioned, with billions and billions of dollars necessary to deal with the pollution problems of the region, for example, you had something created less than some millions of dollars with these water charges, nowhere near the amount of money that would be necessary. And people started to realize that they had to rethink what the charging was. It was no longer going to be the salvation of the committees and of the whole model. It maybe seed money, but funding for would have to come from other sources. And it basically becomes funding for maintaining the management institutions and for small projects, but nowhere near large enough for bigger projects. And also, the model only is going to work in some river basins where you have, for example, industries that can pay large amounts for the amount of water that they use, because highly agricultural areas that use much, much more water, but they have a much lower production value for the water they use, basically couldn't afford the same tiny amounts per cubic meters. and we're going to resist it much more. So it became clear that this charging system was only going to work in some basins. It was only going to be economically viable, and even then only economically viable in the sense of keeping the agencies alive, but maybe not for really solving water management problems. So basically, after so much investment, 20 years of reforming, we finally start to see the results of it, and the results are way less impressive than we expected, which means that the system, grows very, very slowly, but there's been increasing pessimism about its effectiveness. So leading me to my final slide. Basically, what can we learn from this? Why study a process that is so frustrating? Well, I have to say that I did not know it was going to be so frustrating when I started studying it. Everybody was very excited back in the late 90s about this process. And sometimes you get yourself into something that doesn't go exactly the way that you expected. It took a long time for this research to even get to a certain stage because the whole process of development was so slow. But what we found, and one of the main central ideas in the book that I wrote with Mimi Keck, is that this is to sort of explore how this kind of continuous process of design, of policy design, occurs. You don't have design and then implementation. You have design, implementation, redesign, implementation, new design, implementation, kind of this constant rethinking, rebuilding, partial experimentation about parts of the process. And so I think it's important to look at a policy process like this as breaking with our conception of the way policies are created. They're much more fluid and experimental. And as you saw in the introduction to the book, and maybe in these examples I gave, that this experimentation, behind this experimentation, there was a lot of creative action at this kind of small scale, local level, often having reverberations onto the system of itself by creating models or even creating possibilities for changes and shifts in the legislation, and in finding workarounds for the limits to the model. But the whole process, this experimentation process, as I put it, wasn't a linear progress towards, towards a vaccine, the way we think of experimentation in science. Like all we want to do is get to that vaccine, and we think of it as this, linear progress that it's going to definitely get there. But in policy, this is not exactly the way experimentation necessarily goes. And we can see in the story that that part of the problem here was this cognitive limitation of the way that the form itself was perceived. And in the end, what is interesting is how resistant the actors involved are to rethinking that model, even though it is seen as having been frustrating and not having done what they expected. So what you hear a lot of times these days is that even though it's clear to me, at least, that the pro-market features of the reform model are the weakest links. That the fact that the money that you wanted to get the people who are going to pay to decide how much to pay, and then you're surprised when they don't want to pay very much. That this is sort of the weak link in the whole model that was going to turn around this water charging system. But instead, what is often blamed these days is the participatory institutions. Participation doesn't work because that collaboration that we hoped would happen didn't occur, because there was this highly idealized conception of participation. So it's easy just to say, oh, it's participation that's going wrong. And so you see, different proposals happening, both ranging from let's go back to kind of a more centralized technocratic decision making, or let's just not have water regulation, do a more market process, or the reaffirmation of the idea of voluntary cooperation. So like one of the big agendas in the late 2010s of the National Water Agency was a national pact for water. That was basically another way of saying, let's just get people talking, that then they will start cooperating. And so this idea is very resilient and seems to be, to me, part of the difficulty in thinking of another way to reform. But of course, I should end by the fact that I see that in the last 4 or 5 years, since Brazil has been going under a great deal of political crises, part of which is the increasing dominance of the austerity agenda, and the dismantlement of the state agenda now is currently, especially in areas that have to do with environmental regulation, is particularly strong. Pretty much any change is, the people who are who have defended this reform and who defend reforming the reform are now very wary of doing that for fear that any kind of change could just be the elimination of the advances, and even the sort of modest advances that have been taken. So that's my takeaway about water management in Brazil, and about how you can think about it as a process created by people who are political, but they're also experimental, and they're also relational, and the process is not ideal. It's not straightforward, and that's kind of what I hope I hope that we can learn from this kind of story. That's my talk.
Thank you. I think we have a little bit of time for some questions we can sneak in. So
Terrific.
I'm going to pivot as quickly as we can for those. Thank you so much. And yeah, I guess this is when we
I'm getting claps. Thank you.
And I'll let people, if you can sort of signal, or if you want to use the chat. And I don't know, Ian, if you can sort of help me here if there are questions.
I've got the chat window open.
Great. So I'd like to maybe kick us off a little bit to talk about, I have 2 questions. Maybe you can choose between them if you want. One is, this is a really detailed account of this implementation of this idealistic perspective of integrated water resource management. And I was wondering if on publication of the book or in presentation of the book, sort of the reception of it, if others found that your account accords with theirs, or sort of what the dialogue has been sort of after the fact. And then my other question, and really, I don't want to hog it, I'm just kind of curious about, Brazilian politics is just notorious for corruption. And every time you're talking about people's willingness to sort of pay money towards the system, I was wondering to what degree the political polarization or sort of distrust in politics, largely sort of informed the problems of this process.
Okay, do you want me to start answering, or you want to see if anybody else has? Or while I answer, other people can think of their questions, or other.
Yeah, that was kind of a stalling mechanism.
Okay, I can do that.
Fine, yeah.
You guys can think of your questions while I answer. And it's interesting that it's interesting to me how, in many ways, I found that people agree with us. For example, since I have not been doing so much research on water management, I looked around for some things that have been written recently. And one of the things I found, I can even send it to you guys if you want to see, because it was in English, is a paper written by a man who works in the National Water Agency. So he's sort of like one of these bureaucrats, water bureaucrat, defenders of the model, and kind of somebody who's been around for a really long time in the whole water management. And he cites our book from the beginning to the end, and he never says anything bad about it. I mean, it's clearly a reference as to, and he describes this frustrating process, and it's very, and it's sort of, I think, frustrating. I think I even put it in my title because I saw it in his title, and so I figured I was allowed to say frustrating. That the title of his article has the word frustrating in it. At the same time, he reproduces this language that I find so disconcerting, which is that if only we could get people to stop being political and to start cooperating, like what we really knew, or it's kind of, the problem is that we never really implemented the legislation fully. Like if we really did it all or if people fulfilled their responsibilities, it would all work. So that it's kind of this language which still reaffirms, not that the system itself is flawed in any way, but people are flawed. And that is the kind of language that, through so much of my research, I would hear. I don't know if it's a part of, I would like to do another someday, if I could do everything I wanted to do. There's some research about sort of the culture of engineers, because a lot of these people who are putting this together are engineers, and not to say, there's nothing particularly wrong about engineers, but there's something about engineers when they do policy that they think of policy kind of like bridges. That if things are just put together in the right way, it should work. And it's a very interesting. I mean, I've known a lot of people who are engineers who are it's hard to get them to think about messiness and about conflict as part of the nature of politics, and that an effective political system will know how, will be able to deal with politics and especially with inequalities, because essential to this process is that as soon as they start, like in the Paraíba do Sul basin that I mentioned, as soon as charging became something that was going to happen, the whole committee got taken over by the more powerful water users. The civil society groups kind of lost. They were all kind of, they were just able to elect themselves into the seats for not just users, but also for civil society and also for the municipal. They kind of were able to take over the committee. So, and that was part of the process. And this control by the, by the more powerful interests, as long as the committees weren't doing anything, they weren't doing much control. But as soon as the committees had, money was in place, there was this mobilization by the powerful, and that kind of phenomenon isn't even mentioned. It's not even on the radar of a lot of the ideology behind this. So that's kind of what. Yes, they agree that it's been frustrating and it hasn't worked, but they also seem to reproduce this weird idealism or lack of recognition that participation is a political process in which people, that you have to be able to think about how you're going to deal with inequality and political inequality if you really want a participatory process to work effectively. And it may not always work effectively because of that, but certainly you shouldn't put all of your expectations into people being good. That's kind of that. Corruption, it's interesting that one of the, I think that what happened in the way that the water management legislation was created is that a lot of basically what they did was a lot of the infrastructure related corruption that would happen outside of the system. So we have more like a weak system or a technically weak, technically strong, different agencies with different technical capacities, but there isn't a lot of discussion about corruption within the water management institutions. A lot of that stuff is because other agencies are building dams and like the huge water transfer in the San Francisco Basin was one of the largest projects during the Lula era. Certainly, I mean, we don't know because the huge corruption scandals have happened in Brazil that had a lot to do with building and stuff, but most of the ones that were related to infrastructure we do not know about. I mean, they haven't become scandals, so we can just presume that kind of stuff, that there was large scale corruption, but that kind of stuff hasn't really appeared too much in the what do you call it, in the police investigation process. Sort of been off the radar, but there was definitely corruption related to these giant water transfer projects and dams and things like that. And those things were implemented by other agencies. And that was part of what was frustrating, was the inability of these little committees to have any influence over those decisions. They were completely outside and kind of outside of the loop. So for example, in Sao Paulo in 2003, the city of Sao Paulo receives a huge amount of its water from the neighboring river basin, the Piracicaba River Basin, which is it's in the metropolitan region of Sao Paulo, and it's a huge percentage of, I can't remember right now how much of the water. There's another chapter in the book about that, but I forget what the percentage of it is. In 2003, there was a huge organizing process in which the River Basin Committee, that was one of the most technically competent committees, kind of brokered this deal with the Sao Paulo state government to reduce the dependence of the city of Sao Paulo on this river basin, because it was lacking in water for the river basin itself, which also it's an important technological center of the Sao Paulo state, and there was not enough water for the river basin itself. They were giving all their water away to the city of Sao Paulo. So there was this whole kind of agreement set up in which the state of Sao Paulo was going to invest in water, in other sources of water, and in water infrastructure that would revert this. And none of that happened, and it just didn't happen. The decisions were not implemented, and there was nothing that the committee could do because it was this cooperative pact. And in 2014, there was a major water crisis in Sao Paulo, where there had to be water rationing, and there was climate change provoked water drought of serious proportions that had been, that was more or less foreseen years before. And basically the water agency, the state water agency responsible for sanitation and water supply, that, is on all these committees, is supposed to be, cooperating and investigating, just refused to give any information at all about what it was doing. And the governor at the time passed a law making all information state secret. So is there corruption there? I don't know, but why do you need to make a state secret about water policy, water management, And weird things were going on there, that there was all this, that the lack of, it was kind of more like these committees were outside of the process. And it could, your point is really important, because one of the things that has been completely missed in this whole process of combating corruption in Brazil, is that one of the ways that you can protect against corruption is having effective social accountability. And spaces like these, where civil society is involved in following what governments can do, can be spaces of transparency, of promoting transparency, of requiring transparency, but only if you make them into strong spaces where governments are required to give information and required to say what they're doing. And so you kind of created these weak participatory spaces. In other areas of politics, stronger participatory spaces have been more effective, but even so, they're never quite effective enough. But what's been happening lately is that the idea is to get rid of the state altogether. There was this huge transition in government that was based on the idea of combating corruption. But the new government, what it does is it says, well, let's just get rid of the state altogether. And we're dismantling with that these participatory institutions. The river basin committees have more or less not been affected by that, by this dismantling, perhaps because they're so innocuous that it's not worth troubling with them. I mean, it's legally a little bit harder for particular reasons, but they're kind of just there doing their thing. Excuse me, my throat got.
We have a question from Francesca in the chat window. What is the conversation trending towards for the future of water management in Brazil? Is it looking like more reforms will be put into place, or a new system coming? I feel like you were starting to get there.
Well, no, I mean, depends on what you're talking about. There has been the passage of new legislation related to water services. I mean, what we're talking about in this, I may not have made totally clear, but the water reform that we're talking about is the water resources management, rivers and lakes, and quality and quantity. But one of the components of water resources are the sanitation and water services. And there has been reform in various ways in sanitation and water services. And one of the things that happened this year, while we were having a pandemic, and so they could pass some laws really quick that nobody was paying attention to, was that legislation was passed to make it a lot easier to privatize water services, which has not, I mean, water itself is public, but the services can be privatized. And there have been experiments in Brazil with the privatization of water services, some of which have been done better than others. But the current government and Congress passed legislation to try to make it easier, and this is some direction that might be happening. So that's I don't know if you call that a reform. That's the kind of process that I fear is in the direction, because there's no real evidence that privatizing is useful for actually guaranteeing access to water and effective water prices and distribution for certain water services. Within the water management process, as I said, the water resources management realm, you kind of have this stagnation, and I think it's kind of a cognitive lock. Nobody has I have not heard really alternative ideas of like a new reform. People talk about kind of deepening the reform that already exists, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to be working so well. And at the same time, people are afraid of losing what little has been gained if you rock the boat at a time that the government is so after, dismantling anything it can. what happened is, one interesting thing that happened in the Bolsonaro government is that in 2019, when Bolsonaro took office, on the first day of office, there was a government restructuring in which the Ministry of Environment lost a lot of its competencies, and including like for deforestation and climate change, things you'd expect the Ministry of Environment in Brazil to care about. And the minister who was put there is this guy who basically he is referred to here as the anti-minister of environment, because his objective is to stop all environmental policy. And he put, police officials in control of the protected areas agency, and basically has totally stopped any kind. I mean, it's really quite outrageous what has happened in the Ministry of Environment and its autarchies, which are responsible for protective areas, environmental licensing, combating deforestation, all that kind of stuff. It's basically shrieked to a stop. But one of the things that they did was that they took the National Water Agency and the whole water thing out of the Ministry of Environment and put it in the ministry, in a ministry responsible for regional development. And this may have been, although that ministry is also, it used to be in the old days, that ministry used to always be called kind of the Ministry of Corruption, because it's where these big infrastructure projects come around. But it might be at least a place where the water agenda seems to have somebody who's interested in it surviving. But not, it seems to be able to, it hasn't been so deeply affected by dismantlement as the agencies that remained in the Ministry of Environment. So that may not have been the worst thing for water management in Brazil right now. They're kind of laying low, as far as I can understand, and trying not to have anybody notice, and continuing on with a lot of effort towards more, kind of technical, being a technical agency, which is what that water agency has gained a reputation for. But I mean, major reform, right now in Brazil, everything is about, keeping things from getting dismantled at best. Reform only in the sense of dismantling as thought of as a reform, or austerity policies are also called reforms, or getting rid of labor rights, they also call those reforms, or getting rid of Social Security, they also call it a reform. So if you're thinking of reform as like making something new and creating something, this is not the historical moment for that in Brazil, unfortunately.
Great. We have another question that I've noticed. A couple of students had submitted this question actually prior to the talk, and that is sort of the intersection of these water policies and their effect specifically on Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
Role of Indigenous communities and how they were impacted by these processes, or sort of where things are at now.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Indigenous people who live in the Amazon are not particularly affected by these specific policies, because these policies practically are not implemented in the Amazon region. It doesn't really make sense to charge for water in a place where water is so abundant. So the abundance of water in the Amazon kind of made the water mechanisms not really apply. There are some river basin committees in the Amazon, but the main things that happen that affect Indigenous people that have to do with water are related to dams and mining. Illegal mining. It affects water quality and mercury poisoning and that kind of stuff. And all that affects Indigenous people quite greatly. It doesn't go through this water system that I studied. I mean, I have done some other research on big infrastructure. One of the things I did after finishing the book on water was do some research, especially on the Belo Monte Dam and other things like that. And so, the energy sector, it was always remained relatively autonomous from this effort to create an integrated water management system. And although legally dams and energy are part of the system and would have to be approved by the system, it's a sector that is so much more powerful and has so much more money that that kind of approval is almost doesn't even, And the approval doesn't go through the committees. It's like water rights to build the Belamonte Dam. The National Water Agency had to approve, but it was just a political decision. It had already been decided by the government to create it. So that wasn't, it was actually within the Ministry of Environment where the environmental license for the dam um, required the construction of the dam to take into account its social and environmental impacts. That there was much more dispute and much more attempt to diminish the effects, but unfortunately it was quite it was also not very effective. Unfortunately, although the period that the Workers' Party was in government in Brazil from 2003 to 2016, you had quite a lot of improvement in certain areas in social policy and in creating more participatory decision-making processes in many different policy areas. But when it came into contradiction with major economic priorities, those efforts were basically innocuous. And so, since environmental licensing was seen as referred to as a stone in the shoe of Brazil's development, yes, he actually said that. So, and President Dilma, who was Lula's successor, left-wing progressive, but they were going to build that Belamonte Dam, and it was quite shocking, the incapacity to do. I mean, it may not be possible to build the Belamonte Dam at all without having terrible impacts on indigenous populations in that region, but the effort was quite great to avoid having consultations and having there were, I can go on and on about this. There was some money for compensating measures, but the conflicts were extremely high. And you probably have, that's a whole other area of research, but it's not exactly what this book is about, but it's an issue. So indigenous people, yeah, a problem. But mostly in the Amazon, there's certainly indigenous groups elsewhere in Brazil, and I don't know exactly any specific cases. The main conflicts you would find in where like things like big projects, dams, especially, and indigenous groups, and it's just constant.
Okay, I think we're a little over time. We're about 10 minutes over time, although this class usually goes till 5:45. But I don't know if we have one more question. I know Stephen, you wanted to chime in, and then I think we covered a lot of the other ones. I hope I have summarized them well. Is there any last questions, or go ahead, Stephen?
Well, I mean, I want to make sure you feel like you covered the students' ones first.
The only one that I'm wondering about is Caitlin's about the degree of democratization. And I'm wondering if we've covered some of that from sort of just talking about these changes over administrations and corruption.
I'm not even sure how to answer that question. I see it here.
Yeah.
Because it's an interesting question, but I'm not sure if there even is a relationship, because democratization is a process that occurs. Well, I mean, it's not really a thing that we can measure exactly, but the process of de-democratization that's occurring in Brazil is also occurring in local governments too. I mean, we have it may be like particularly bad at the federal level, but for example, all these advances of creating participatory spaces throughout Brazil were very much connected to left-wing governments, and they're basically under attack all throughout the country. So I mean, the decline of the electoral decline of the left has been associated with the decline of participatory initiatives that have kind of been easily, thrown away without much care. I mean, they still exist in some ways, in some formal ways. They've been created by law, and it's not so simple to get rid of them. And well-organized participatory spaces have become spaces of resistance to change. But I mean, I'm thinking when you say like the question of democratization, the one of the specific things that we see happening is related to the reduction of these participatory spaces. And I think it's kind of across the board. It's been happening in local governments as well. And so I'm not so sure. Yeah, I think that without the, I mean, I don't idealize participatory spaces, but I do think that you have a reduction of various processes that are making it more and more difficult for people to follow what government is doing. And a kind of more authoritarian tendency is getting rid of accountability in general. But I don't know about the between federal and local governments. I'm not quite sure how. I'd have to think about that.
Great. Okay. Stephen, is it short, or do you think we should wrap up?
It's fairly short, but I mean, we probably should wrap up.
No, say we want to hear at least a question.
I want to hear it? Okay, so I mean, you've made abundantly clear that politics are involved in these types of issues. Of course they are, but I'm wondering, you know, beyond the question of how politics affects certain decisions, I'm wondering if these issues of water management, water use, have become proxies for political arguments, in the sense, sort of like in the sense of how wearing a mask or not wearing a mask in the United States has not so much become a health question, it's become, you know, what side of the political spectrum are you on question. So I'm wondering if there's sort of been this movement towards just taking it away, taking the water management question away from water management and just making it to a purely political question.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you just said about the mask is interesting, because you remember not that long ago when we were all like, no, it would be really weird to wear a mask. Only Asians wear masks all the time. Whereas in other places that people are all wearing masks, and we're not going to do we're not going to think about these pandemic things, because it always, all the other times it works itself out before it comes to our countries. And, you know, so this is not like something on our political radar that we're going to worry about. Like, we all have a very clear memory of that feeling of not really caring about pandemics, right? Well, that's how water is. Water is a thing that's always possible. It's always, I mean, we need it. We use it all the time. We need it. We had, you know, I had to have some before. I have an empty glass here, but it was full when I started. And you know, so water is necessary, but we don't think about it politically until all of a sudden something bad happens. And I think it's very similar in that sense to the you know, the difficulty of putting something on the agenda, and then, you know, there's a crisis. And so we had this, you know, recent crisis in Sao Paulo with a serious drought, and it suddenly became extremely political, and there was a lot of fake news, and there was lying, and there was, you know, the government trying to cover up stuff, and all kinds of stuff happened. And then it's, you know, but then it kind of went away as well. You know, once the problem was resolved, it went away. It seems to be an area of politics that is very difficult to create consistent organizations that really are kind of constantly. In Brazil, it has been very hard to develop a water-related civil society. I mean, there's a lot of social movements related to other environmental issues, but water seems to be almost so universal and everywhere, and so complex and used by so many different areas. I mean, one environmentalist once told me that they didn't get into water because it was too technical, you know? And so I've heard a lot of, you know, there's this kind of almost feeling like it's just not an area for mobilization. And then all of a sudden, once in a while, there's a crisis, and people are talking about water, but it doesn't, it seems to be very difficult to get it to kind of have consistent political mobilization. I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about. Certainly I haven't, you know, you don't see a lot of polarization about water. You see polarization about things like dams, you know, that actually are like directly affecting, you know, kind of extreme effects. You see polarization once there is droughts. People don't want to have their water rationed. And so all of a sudden they, you know, start blaming each other, or wanting other people's water being rationed, but not themselves, and that kind of stuff. But as long as that kind of stuff isn't happening, it's a very difficult area for mobilizing the public interest. I think it's a perfect example, you know, from a political science view, of a diffuse good that's very, very difficult to organize interest around. And I think it's a perennial problem because, in some places we see people organizing around water issues, but it seems to be like a constant lack of sufficient mobilization. It probably explains part of the reason why people who are mobilized think that it's not a political issue.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in, and I just want to thank Dr. Rebecca Abers so much for joining us, and for everyone for joining us for the talk here at the International Studies Institute. I'm sure you've got a long trip home or walk to your kitchen now, so thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
I'm so sorry we can't all go out for a beer or something.
Next time.
Yeah, it would be great. I so hope that there is a next time. We can talk about other things too, or something happy, how it all ended well.
Well, it sounds like there's an opportunity to hear more about your COVID research. I think that will be a lot of interest.
That would be fun.
So.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Really
Okay.
nice to meet all of you.
Thank you all.
So much. Bye-bye.